Imagine being born into a world where the color of your skin determines your place in society, where every glance, every word, every opportunity is filtered through the lens of race. Now imagine that the world sees you one way, while your heritage tells another story entirely. This was the extraordinary reality of Walter Francis White, born in 1893 in Atlanta, Georgia, with fair skin, blonde hair, and piercing blue eyes. Walter looked like someone who could walk unnoticed through the privileged streets of white society. But beneath that appearance lay a rich African-American heritage that would shape the course of his life and define his extraordinary mission. From the very beginning, Walter's life was a study in contrasts. While his physical features allowed him to blend into the dominant society, his experiences in Atlanta exposed him to the harsh realities of segregation and racial violence. Even as a child, he witnessed and endured the injustices that defined the lives of Black Americans in the early 20th century. Yet instead of hiding from his identity, Walter embraced it fully, understanding that the very traits that made him appear different could also become powerful tools in the fight for justice. This is a story of courage, ingenuity, and determination, a story of a man who navigated two worlds, challenged the status quo, and risked everything to expose injustice. Over the next few minutes, we will journey through Walter White's remarkable life, from his formative years in Atlanta to his groundbreaking work with the NAACP, and discover how one man's identity became a key weapon in the fight for civil rights. If you are ready to uncover the untold story of Walter Francis White and the challenges he faced while standing up for justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating stories from history that continue to inspire today. Walter Francis White grew up in a household where learning and discipline were woven into the very fabric of daily life, a home where curiosity and intellect were not just encouraged but expected. His parents, George and Maline White, were remarkable figures in their own right, each having graduated from Atlanta University, an institution that had long stood as a beacon of education and empowerment for African Americans in the post-Reconstruction South. George, a postal worker, and Maline, a devoted teacher, instilled in Walter a profound respect for knowledge, an appreciation for history, and a keen awareness of the responsibilities that came with privilege. However complicated that privilege might be, their guidance was strict yet purposeful. Walter recalled how his father would insist that he read only books that were at least a quarter of a century old, a rule designed not to limit his imagination but to anchor his understanding in the lessons of the past, ensuring that he absorbed the depth of human experience rather than the fleeting trends of contemporary thought. From his earliest years, Walter moved through the educational system with a sense of both opportunity and weighty expectation. The Atlanta public schools provided the foundation for his academic life, but it was at Atlanta University High School and later Atlanta University College where his mind and character were truly shaped. These institutions were more than places of learning. They were incubators for young African American leaders, nurturing not only intellectual growth but also moral courage and a sense of duty to the broader community. Here, Walter encountered mentors and peers who challenged him to think critically about the world around him, to question injustices, and to recognize the complexities of identity, heritage, and society. He absorbed lessons in literature, philosophy, and the sciences, each discipline offering him a lens through which to examine the inequities he observed and the potential strategies for addressing them. Yet education for Walter was never an abstract pursuit. It was inseparable from lived experience. Walking the streets of Atlanta, he observed the stark divide between black and white communities, the unspoken rules that governed every interaction, and the precariousness of black life in a city still haunted by the specter of violence and segregation. It was in this environment, fortified by the intellectual and ethical guidance of his parents and teachers, that Walter began to understand the duality of his own existence. A man whose skin could allow him passage into a world that often denied access to his community, yet whose heart and identity were firmly rooted in the struggles and triumphs of African American life. Graduating from Atlanta University College in 1916, Walter emerged not only with a degree, but with a clarity of purpose that would define his life. He carried with him the lessons of resilience and responsibility imparted by his parents, the analytical and moral rigor fostered by his educators, and a deep awareness of the inequities that pervaded the society he was entering. These formative years equipped him with the tools to navigate both opportunity and danger, to confront injustice with intellect and courage, and to wield his unique position with strategy and compassion. Walter's education was never simply about academic achievement. It was a preparation for leadership, a cultivation of vision, and an immersion in the reality that knowledge alone was insufficient without the will to act in service of justice and equality. It was this blend of rigorous learning, ethical grounding, and first-hand observation of society's divisions that would later empower him to take on the formidable challenges of civil rights work, bridging worlds and identities in ways that few could imagine, and setting the stage for a life dedicated to confronting the inequalities of his time with insight, bravery, and unyielding commitment. As Walter Francis White grew older, the lessons of his home and the halls of Atlanta University were continually tested by the harsh realities of the world outside, a world where the color of his skin, though lighter than many around him, could not shield him from the pervasive injustices that defined the era. From the earliest moments of his childhood, he was confronted with segregation, the rigid codes that dictated where he could walk, what water fountain he could drink from, and the subtle yet relentless scrutiny that followed him through public spaces, classrooms, and neighborhoods. Yet it was not simply the daily indignities that left their mark on young Walter. It was the moments of unthinkable violence, moments that would burn themselves into his memory and shape the moral compass that would guide him for the rest of his life. Among these, none was more searing than the Atlanta Race Massacre of 1906, an eruption of terror and brutality that would come to symbolize both the dangers facing African Americans and the urgent necessity of advocacy and resistance. In the days leading up to the riot, rumors and fears, often exaggerated and malicious, spread through the city, fanning the flames of resentment among white residents toward the black community, a community that was striving for advancement, dignity, and recognition. When the violence finally erupted on September 22nd, it did so with horrifying speed and intensity. White mobs roamed the streets, indiscriminately attacking black families, homes, and businesses, while law enforcement looked on or actively facilitated the violence. Walter, though only 13 at the time, found himself and his family directly in the path of danger. Together with his father, he defended their home from the mob, a terrifying and formative experience that thrust him into a confrontation with the raw, unfiltered hatred of the society in which he lived. In those chaotic hours, Walter saw the vulnerability of life and the fragility of justice, understanding in ways that no textbook or lecture could teach him the stakes of racial prejudice and the cost of inaction. The massacre left an indelible impression on him, not just as a witness to cruelty, but as a participant in the struggle to survive and protect those he loved. He realized that identity, perception, and courage were inextricably intertwined, and that his unique appearance, the very traits that allowed him to pass in white society, could serve as both shield and instrument in navigating a divided world. These early experiences of danger and oppression did not instill fear alone. They sparked a determination, a moral clarity that would guide his choices and ambitions. Walter began to understand that the fight for justice was not an abstract ideal but a tangible, urgent mission, one that required both strategy and empathy, observation and action, intellect and courage. As he matured, These lessons coalesced into a guiding principle: that personal advantage could be harnessed for the collective good, and that navigating the boundaries of race with skill and insight could allow him to challenge injustice from within and without. The trauma of witnessing the indiscriminate violence against his community, coupled with the nurturing and disciplined upbringing his parents had provided, forged in Walter a rare combination of moral fortitude, resilience, and tactical acumen. This combination would later enable him to undertake dangerous investigations, confront systemic discrimination, and advocate for reforms that would transform the landscape of civil rights in America. The memories of 1906, of the cries in the streets, the barricades, and the desperate defense of his home, remained with Walter throughout his life, shaping a consciousness that recognized both the profound vulnerability and extraordinary strength of the human spirit, and compelling him to dedicate his life to a cause far larger than himself, to fight for justice, equality, and dignity in a world that too often denied all three to those of his heritage. Despite his strikingly fair complexion, blue eyes, and blonde hair, Walter Francis White never allowed his appearance to distance him from the rich heritage and lived realities of the African American community that had shaped his upbringing. From a young age, he understood the duality of his existence. The world often saw him as white, a perception that could shield him from the immediate prejudices and dangers faced by black individuals in the early 20th century. Yet his identity, his upbringing, and his moral compass were firmly rooted in the struggles and aspirations of his community. This awareness did not lead him to deny his heritage or live in secrecy. Rather, it cultivated a keen understanding of human behavior, social dynamics, and the rigid racial structures that governed American life. Walter learned to observe, to listen, and to maneuver within spaces where his true identity might have placed him in harm's way, all while maintaining an unshakable commitment to justice and equality. As he matured, Walter transformed this duality into a powerful instrument for advocacy. He recognized that his ability to pass as white, combined with the education, discipline, and resilience instilled by his parents, offered him unique access to spaces where he could gather information, build relationships, and effect change that would have been nearly impossible for someone openly identified as African American at the time. His experiences with segregation and racial violence, from the humiliations of everyday discrimination to the life-threatening chaos of events like the Atlanta Race Massacre, had instilled in him both a profound empathy for the oppressed and a meticulous sense of strategy, teaching him that courage alone was insufficient without careful planning and nuanced understanding of one's surroundings. This rare skill set became central to his work with the NAACP, where he often undertook perilous investigations of lynchings, racial riots, and other acts of injustice throughout the American South. By assuming the guise of a white man, Walter could approach hostile communities, gain the trust or complacency of perpetrators, and uncover the stark realities of racial violence that others could not access. Each mission required not only the careful management of his outward appearance, but also the careful calibration of words, demeanor, and actions, an intricate dance that demanded intelligence, emotional acuity, and unwavering courage. Yet even while leveraging his appearance to protect himself and advance his work, he remained deeply conscious of the moral imperative that drove him. He was acting not to benefit personally, but to expose injustice, protect vulnerable communities, and mobilize public awareness and policy change. Walter's ability to navigate these dual racial worlds was more than a tactical advantage. It reflected a profound understanding of the social fabric of his time. It allowed him to bridge divides, to confront the perpetrators of violence face to face, and to bear witness to the systemic inequities that perpetuated suffering across generations. He could move fluidly between spaces that were otherwise segregated by fear and prejudice, all while maintaining a strong moral center anchored in his African American identity. This mastery of perception and presence became a hallmark of his activism, shaping his investigative approach and amplifying the impact of his work. In effect, Walter White's dual existence was not a contradiction, but a conduit through which he channeled insight, strategy, and justice, transforming the complexities of his personal identity into a potent instrument for civil rights advocacy that would leave a lasting imprint on American history. In 1918, Walter Francis White took his first formal step into the turbulent world of civil rights activism when he joined the NAACP as Assistant Secretary, a position that would quickly place him at the forefront of some of the most dangerous and urgent struggles for justice in the United States. The nation was still gripped by the terror of lynching, pervasive segregation, and widespread racial prejudice, and the African American community faced threats that ranged from subtle societal exclusion to outright violence. Walter, armed with the unique advantage of his fair complexion and his deep understanding of both black and white worlds, immediately recognized how his identity could serve the cause. He did not shrink from danger. Instead, he embraced the risks inherent in his work, understanding that exposing the truth of racial violence required courage, ingenuity, and a willingness to confront hostility directly. As he moved from Assistant Secretary to Executive Secretary, White's work became increasingly bold and wide-reaching. He traveled throughout the South and other regions where racial terror was most acute, often posing as a white journalist, salesman, or official in order to infiltrate communities where information about lynchings, mob violence, and systemic discrimination was deliberately concealed. These undercover operations demanded extraordinary composure and meticulous planning. A single misstep could have meant death, as mobs were quick to enact vigilant justice against anyone perceived to be a threat to their social order. Yet Walter navigated these perils with a combination of tact, intelligence, and unshakable commitment to justice. His investigations not only documented the horrors of lynching and racial intimidation, but also revealed patterns of complicity among local authorities, businesses, and ordinary citizens, painting a stark portrait of systemic oppression that few outside the affected communities had ever witnessed firsthand. White's campaigns extended beyond investigation into the legislative arena, where he tirelessly pushed for anti-lynching laws and broader civil rights reforms. He lobbied members of Congress, engaged with sympathetic allies, and used the detailed evidence gathered from his fieldwork to make compelling arguments that exposed the moral and social costs of maintaining a society steeped in racial terror, even when faced with political obstruction, widespread indifference, or overt hostility. Walter's approach combined legal strategy, moral persuasion, and public advocacy, leveraging his intellect and credibility to amplify the voices of those whose lives were most endangered. His work was not abstract or symbolic. It was deeply rooted in lived experience, informed by both the horrors he had witnessed as a child and the acute awareness of systemic inequality he had cultivated throughout his education and early exposure to the realities of segregation. In undertaking these missions, Walter's dual identity became an indispensable tool, allowing him to traverse spaces that would have been inaccessible to most African Americans at the time, while never losing sight of his commitment to the community he represented. Each investigation, each exposure of injustice, carried the potential to shift public perception, sway policymakers, and provide the NAACP with the documentation and moral authority necessary to challenge entrenched racial hierarchies. By the time he had assumed full leadership at the NAACP, White had already established a model of activism that combined meticulous fieldwork, strategic engagement, and ethical resolve, transforming the fight against lynching and segregation from isolated protests into a coordinated, evidence-based campaign for justice. His life and work during this period demonstrate not only extraordinary courage, but also a profound understanding of the power of identity, strategy, and moral clarity in confronting the systemic inequities of early 20th century America, laying a foundation for the civil rights advancements that would follow in subsequent decades. Walter Francis White's impact extended far beyond field investigations and public exposure of racial violence. He moved deftly into the intricate corridors of American politics and legislation, understanding that lasting change required transforming social outrage into concrete policy. By the time he assumed the role of executive secretary at the NAACP, White had cultivated both the credibility and the strategic insight to influence the highest levels of government, leveraging his position to challenge entrenched systems of discrimination while building alliances with sympathetic lawmakers, activists, and legal minds. One of his most notable early triumphs came in 1930 when he played a decisive role in defeating the Supreme Court nomination of Judge John J. Parker, whose record and public statements had clearly indicated opposition to black suffrage and civil rights. White marshaled evidence, personal advocacy, and public opinion in a manner that revealed not only Parker's prejudices, but also the broader stakes of allowing individuals hostile to equality to occupy positions of ultimate judicial authority, demonstrating the power of organized, principled, and persistent civil rights advocacy. White's strategic acumen was not limited to singular battles, but extended to nurturing the next generation of legal advocates who would carry the movement forward. Recognizing the importance of law in dismantling systemic inequality, he supported young Thurgood Marshall, who would later become the first African-American Supreme Court justice, by providing mentorship, resources, and opportunities within the NAACP to challenge wrongful convictions and fight discriminatory laws in courts across the nation. White understood that legislation and judicial decisions were both shields and instruments in the broader struggle for equality. He used his influence to ensure that legal battles were pursued with precision, foresight, and moral clarity, addressing not only individual injustices, but also the structural inequities that allowed them to persist. His engagement in political advocacy was equally multifaceted. White tirelessly challenged discriminatory state constitutions, voting barriers, and Jim Crow legislation, navigating the complex interplay between federal and state authorities, public sentiment, and partisan interests. He recognized that the disenfranchisement of African Americans in southern states was not merely a violation of individual rights but a calculated strategy to sustain political control, social hierarchy, and economic dominance. By mobilizing public opinion, coordinating with sympathetic politicians, and presenting meticulously documented evidence of racial injustices, White exerted pressure that made it increasingly difficult for elected officials to ignore the moral and political consequences of upholding discriminatory policies. Even when legislation he supported, such as anti-lynching bills, failed to pass, his efforts contributed to a climate of awareness and moral accountability that gradually reshaped the discourse around race, justice, and civic responsibility in America. White's influence was both immediate and enduring. Through strategic lobbying, precise legal interventions, and relentless advocacy, he demonstrated how one individual, equipped with insight, courage, and an acute understanding of social and political systems, could alter the course of legislative outcomes and shape the trajectory of civil rights. He bridged worlds, from the street-level realities of violence and intimidation to the chambers of Congress and the offices of legal reformers, using every tool at his disposal to dismantle barriers and empower the marginalized. In doing, he not only challenged the overt injustices of his time, but also laid the groundwork for future generations to expand the reach of civil rights through law, policy, and unwavering moral clarity, leaving a legacy that underscored the profound intersection of activism, legal strategy, and political influence in the pursuit of equality. While Walter Francis White's public life was defined by his tireless activism and political strategy, his contributions to American culture and intellectual life were no less profound, extending the impact of his vision into the realms of literature, mentorship, and the Harlem Renaissance. White possessed a rare ability to translate the complex realities of race, identity, and social injustice into narratives that resonated both within and beyond the African American community. His novels, including Rope and Flight, were more than mere works of fiction. They were incisive explorations of the tensions and contradictions of racial identity in a society defined by rigid segregation and systemic prejudice. Rope, for instance, traced the tragic consequences of lynching and racial violence, compelling readers to confront the human cost of hatred and fear, while Flight examined the nuanced challenges faced by those who could pass as white yet remained tethered to a heritage society sought to marginalize. Through these works, White not only chronicled the social realities of his time, but also elevated literature as a vehicle for empathy, understanding, and social change. Beyond his written contributions, White's role as a mentor and cultural advocate positioned him at the heart of the Harlem Renaissance. The dynamic flowering of Black artistic, intellectual, and literary life in New York City during the 1920s and 1930s. He nurtured emerging writers and thinkers, offering guidance, encouragement, and a platform for voices that might otherwise have been silenced by systemic barriers. By leveraging his connections and credibility, White helped cultivate a network of talent that included writers, poets, and scholars who would shape the cultural and intellectual identity of African Americans for generations to come. Harlem, under White's influence and the broader Renaissance movement, became more than a geographic location. It was a symbolic and literal center of Black creativity, resistance, and affirmation, a space where art and activism converged in the pursuit of dignity and recognition. White's literary and cultural endeavors were inseparable from his lifelong commitment to civil rights. His novels, essays, and mentorship were not abstract exercises but deeply entwined with his broader mission to expose injustice, foster awareness, and cultivate empowerment. Through literature, he could reach audiences who might not encounter him through political channels or investigative work, translating the moral urgency of the civil rights struggle into stories that humanized its victims and contextualized its stakes. His engagement with cultural production also reinforced the intellectual and artistic legitimacy of African Americans at a time when such recognition was denied or minimized by mainstream society, challenging pervasive stereotypes and creating enduring spaces for self-expression and social critique. Moreover, White's dual identity, his ability to navigate both Black and white social spheres, enhanced his effectiveness as a cultural mediator, enabling him to advocate for Black artistry and intellect to audiences who might otherwise remain inaccessible. His efforts demonstrated that the fight for justice was not solely a political or legal endeavor, but also a cultural one, where ideas, narratives, and artistic expression could shape public consciousness, challenge prejudice, and inspire collective action. Through his literary output, mentorship, and promotion of the Harlem Renaissance, Walter Francis White extended the reach of his activism into the realm of the imagination, proving that culture and creativity were powerful instruments for social change, and that the elevation of African American voices was essential to the broader struggle for equality, recognition, and dignity in American life. Walter Francis White passed away in 1955 at the age of 61, leaving behind a legacy that was as complex as it was transformative, a life defined by courage, intellect, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Throughout his lifetime, He had navigated the difficult duality of being a man of African American heritage who could pass as white, using this unique position not for personal gain, but as a tool to confront some of the most dangerous and entrenched racial injustices of his time. From his early experiences with segregation and the horrors of the Atlanta race massacre to his decades of activism with the NAACP, White consistently demonstrated that identity could be wielded as a powerful instrument for advocacy, investigation, and social change. His work revealed the human costs of systemic oppression, exposed the brutality of lynchings, challenged discriminatory legislation, and laid the groundwork for generations of legal and social advancements. White's influence extended beyond the courtroom and the halls of Congress. He left an indelible mark on American culture through his literary contributions. From novels like Rope and Flight that explored racial identity and injustice, to essays and mentorship that nurtured the Harlem Renaissance, his efforts created spaces where Black voices could thrive, helping to shape both the intellectual and artistic identity of a generation. At the same time, his political and strategic engagement mentoring figures like Thurgood Marshall, lobbying against unjust Supreme Court appointments, and advocating for civil rights legislation ensured that his impact would resonate in the structural and institutional fabric of American society. Through these combined efforts, White exemplified how one individual, guided by moral clarity and strategic insight, could alter the course of history. His life was recognized during his time and beyond. White received awards for his literary achievements, such as the Harmon Foundation Award for Distinguished Accomplishment among African Americans, and honors from the NAACP for his outstanding civil rights work. Decades later, historians and scholars continue to acknowledge his contributions, naming him among the most influential African Americans in history and celebrating the ways in which his life bridged divides, challenged injustice, and inspired activism. While some contemporaries debated the complexities of his dual identity, the broader consensus celebrates White as a man who devoted his talents, intellect, and courage to advancing equality and confronting the systemic evils of his era. As we reflect on Walter White's extraordinary journey, his story serves as both a lesson and an inspiration. It reminds us that true leadership often requires courage not just in the face of danger, but also in the navigation of moral, social, and cultural complexities. It teaches us that identity, when embraced and wielded with purpose, can be a force for justice, and that dedication, intellect, and strategic action can overcome even the most entrenched systems of oppression. White's life encourages us to engage with history, to recognize the struggles that shape the present, and to continue advocating for a world defined by equality and fairness. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the life of Walter Francis White. If you found his story inspiring, make sure to hit the like button, share this video with friends and family, and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with more stories that uncover hidden histories and celebrate the lives of remarkable individuals who shaped the world we live in today.